Thank you very much for coming out to the Anthology on this rainy-ish kind of evening, and particularly for this program in our single frame series. Single frame is a regular anthology series that focuses on 35mm and other forms of single image slide projection. And we've been doing this now for a year and a half, 2 years, and this is our second in a row, 2 calendars in a row, from Barbara Moore, who we are just so happy to have here for this tour through her collection of Fluxus-related images. Last time around, she brought images that Peter Moore shot related to the Judson Church scene, but also, much more significantly, other scenes that happened concurrently to Judson Church. And it was marvelous. After the show, a number of us attacked her and said this has to be a regular thing. We need to have a school every Monday night. And she ran out the door. So we're very lucky to have her back, and I'll give it over to her in a second. And I just want to remind you about a couple of things. One is that this is not the only single frame on this calendar. We have one coming up with Yuji Agematsu, who is right there in the back. He'll be here on June 19th for a multi-projector experience called Discolored Photos, Faded Things. I'm very excited to see what he'll do with the whole screen. And then I would just remind you, if you don't know already, that the preeminent filmmaker, Ken Jacobs, is turning 80 on Saturday, and will be here Friday, Saturday, and Sunday for a 6-program overview of his insanely prolific body of work, which will include films, rarely screened films on 8mm, 16, even 35, and most video digital formats that he has been able to get his hands on. So please do try to come, and there will be a birthday party for Ken after the 7 o'clock show here at Anthology, which means free booze. But that's all I really have to say, and I'm just so happy that Barbara is back and has brought something amazing for us to see. Thanks.
Thank you. So I've got these notes. And I especially want to thank Andy for giving me this opportunity. Believe it or not, it's my first Fluxus lecture in New York, built around Peter's photographs. All the lectures I've given and all the Fluxus stuff I've done, they've never come together here. Thanks also to John Klaxman and Tim White for their great tech support, and there's as much tech support for slides as there is for anything else. After its initial phase in Europe, 1962 to 1963, Fluxus came to New York. Its first major New York performances took place in spring 1964. Excuse me.
Is there a microphone?
There isn't. That's not a microphone, those are lights. Oh, maybe we'll turn down the AC. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. After its initial phase in Europe, 1962 to 1963, Fluxus came to New York. Its first major New York performances took place in spring 1964 at George Machinis's relatively small loft on Canal Street, then a gritty strip of hardware stores, plastic suppliers, and fabricators and bars. This seminal series also marked the beginning of Peter's and my full immersion in a category of art that would deeply affect our intellectual mindset and personal relationships for years to come. Peter once characterized George as the most incredible person he'd ever met, and similar feelings have been voiced by many others. While Machinis may have named Fluxus and brought unique organizational skill to its activities, there were already numerous unique individuals: Dick Higgins, Allison Knowles, Lamont Young, Jackson McGlow, Yoko Ono, George Brecht, and Bob Watts, to name just a few, who had coalesced into a kind of community, or more accurately, a sub-community of a larger reaction to what Dick Higgins called the going thing. This sub-community grew and grew and grew. Avidly working as an aspiring photojournalist under the name Photo Reporters, Peter placed himself squarely within the very serious context of Life magazine's publications model. But as those of you, and there are quite a few in the audience who knew him, as you were very much aware, he had a quietly devilish streak of brilliant humor. This especially endeared him to Maciunas. I enjoyed an uncountable number of sessions of their dazzling repartee about art life and the blurring between the two, subjects that in other art world hands can be boringly serious. Photographically speaking, this hilarity threatened to interfere with Peter's incipient photojournalism. He said he laughed so much in shooting Fluxus that the camera shook and he had to use a tripod to get a sharp picture. The Canal Street series had a cohesiveness that offers a remarkable visual synthesis of the early Fluxus aesthetic. Rooted in music, yet often more concerned with gesture than with sound, the theoretical side of Fluxus now causes endless, often conflicting academic interpretations. But one look at these pictures reveals a less austere attitude, in which a small group of artists seriously reinterpret everyday experience without forfeiting exuberance and pleasure. Lights, please. So we're going to start at 359 Canal Street, and this is the Fluxus banner hanging outside. You went up a dark stairwell with handprints on the wall, which were a realization of George Brecht's piece, Direction. And then you encountered the Maciunas doorbells. This was a collection of rubber bulbs, push buttons, and pull strings, activating radios, bells, buzzers, and water spray that you would get in the face. And here's another picture of it, close up. And this is Jim Tenney. You can see a little bit of what's inside the door. There are the transistor radios at the bottom, for example. And here's another view that shows you sort of how it works. George lived in this space until the mid-1960s. In the late 1970s, when I was working with dance writer Sally Baines selecting photographs for her book on Judson Dance Theater, I learned that she and her husband Noel Carroll were then living at the same Canal Street address in Maciunas' old loft, not knowing its history. When I showed Sally these pictures, she exclaimed, "I've always wondered what the holes next to the front door were for." The loft consisted of 3 smallish rooms, a far cry from today's hyped conception of such spaces. In addition to a meticulously organized live-work area, there were the loft's entryway, with Jerry Foister's installation, One Way, made of purloined street signs, and facing it, a flux shop, with flux boxes and other publications on the shelves. The third space was the Flux Hall performance area, not more than 15 by 25 feet, here shown in its entirety pretty much, with Peter's pressed against the back wall in order to get this, because it was really quite silent. Pictured is what constituted a full house, a maximum of 15 or 20 people, and usually less. Here Joe Jones is performing his trumpet solo, in which he uses the instrument to blow up a balloon or condom. This is Maciunas on his perch above the proceedings, supervising, making announcements, photographing the action with his own Hasselblad. From the beginning, he, more than any other artist Peter worked with, was aware of the importance of visual documentation. And after meeting Peter at this concert, became one of Peter's most enthusiastic supporters. How could Peter and I not become excited about Fluxus when on that first evening, April 11, 1964, we witnessed Maciunas performing Nam June Paik's masterpiece, One for Violin Solo, in its United States premiere. The work had been performed by the composer himself in those earlier European concerts, but Nam June didn't arrive in the US until summer of '64. And even though Peter eventually did shoot Nam June performing the piece, no other photographs captured the delicious intensity of Maciunas' concentration as he painstakingly raises the violin, only to smash it down suddenly in a terrifying split-second finale. I want to say something now about Fluxus scores. The most common compositional form associated with Fluxus is the word score, a brief and sometimes not so brief printed text. Although many works, such as one for violin solo and the Joe Jones trumpet solo that I mentioned earlier, were first performed extemporaneously and passed down by word of mouth or published descriptions. One of the originators and masters of the word score was George Brett, whose many examples were collected in the first Fluxus boxed edition, Watergap, in 1963. This is what the box looked like with all the little printed cards in it. And if you look in the lower right, there's one called Word Event, and this is it close up. Emphasizing their conceptual aspect, Brecht originally considered these texts as small private epiphanies, that's his word, not intended for public execution. They quickly became the paradigm for so-called classic Fluxus performances. And I know that's an oxymoron, but it's true in a way, of course. Meaning, such as in this score for Brecht's Word Event, it may be elliptical and open to wide interpretation. Once when Maciunas was expounding to me about the functionality of all the Fluxus multiples he produced, I countered that Brecht's work struck me as more Zen-like and poetic than functional. No, Maciunas said, it was primarily functional because, quote, like chess, it exercises the mind, unquote. To conclude the same program on which Pike's violin solo appeared, Brecht appropriately performed Exit by writing that word on the wall and drawing an arrow in the direction of egress. And those strings are from an Alison Knowles piece, a string piece that instructs you to have as many balls of string as you have performers and to entwine, tie up, and surround the audience. That's not the exact words, but for the rest, for a large part of the performance, those strings stayed in place. Another concert in April 1964 was devoted entirely to an audience participation realization of Takahisa Kosugi's theater music, for which the score, as you can see, reads, "Keep walking intently." This printed text appeared in a plastic box of Kosugi's collected scores, similar in concept to Brecht's Watergap. One entered the Flux Hall by walking over a doorway-wide slab of foam rubber that was saturated with black ink. The floor of the room was totally covered with sheets of brightly colored, handmade Japanese rice paper. As the sheets were printed, successive layers were removed, thus creating an entire unnumbered edition of prints. Later that year, Maciunas published one of his most famous and influential editions, Fluxus I, a thick book of bolted together pages and manila envelopes containing objects. It was packaged in a wood box made from skids swiped from neighborhood streets. One of the loosely inserted items was an original print from the theater music performance in April. Nothing demonstrates the fluid interrelationship between Fluxus object, concept, and performance more clearly than this sequence. Theater music began as one constituent of an art object, a flux box. It could be interpreted purely conceptually, as as an example of Macinnis's exercises for the mind, or actually realized as a performance. In Macinnis's version of the latter, the work returned to objecthood, a print edition disseminated through inclusion in a concrete publication. Some other performances that appeared in programs in April and May 1964. This is Macinnis performing Bob Watts's F.H. Trace, and that is the name, is an alternative name, solo for French horn. The K.K. Trace, this shows you how photographs lie, because the K.K. Trace was an earlier piece on the program, and they haven't changed the signage. Anyway, the other name, the more better known name is Solo for French Horn, in which a musician in formal dress enters, faces the audience and bows, spilling beans, BBs, or other small objects that lean forward. This is Brecht performing his solo for violin, in which the full score reads just the word polishing. This work can be transposed for any stringed instrument by a simple change of title. Macinnis and Alison Knowles performing Duet by Congo, in which they sawed at their instruments with tools, such as industrial files or screwdrivers. Congo was a chimpanzee in the London Zoo, who was widely known for his abstract drawings and paintings. In Fluxus 1, the artist's book that I previously showed, Macinnis included two of Congo's drawings, and this is an original page, you may not be able to see it so well here. He included two of Congo's drawings to be used as graphic musical scores. And I've got a little gift for the audience here, which is a whole stack of these, the original pages. And if somebody would just start passing it around. This is Ben Vautier, the blue guy, moving very fast, obviously, visiting from Nice, and Alison Knowles performing Kosugi's Animal One, the score for which is Roll Up a Long Chord. In the Flux Shop, Joe Jones's Electric Chair, and I'm not sure if that's Joe's title or if that's the title Macinnis just called it, because it was a very benign, rather nice audio environment. You stuck your head into it, and there were all these little transistor radios or something around, and you got all these sounds coming at you from all directions. There was a big thing with transistor radios because the hardware stores, if you were around at that time, every artist frequented Canal Street for their raw materials. They were just incredible things, and job lots of hardware and things like transistor radios and motors. Joe Jones used a lot of that stuff. Dick Higgins performing Brecht's drip music, which involves, once again, this isn't the exact text, water transferred from one place to another. Oh, by the way, in that earlier piece, the piece on the floor is one of Ben Patterson's dances, which was placed there so that anyone could perform it. This is Namjoon Paik's Zen for Film, a 45-minute or so projection of blank film theater for this world premiere of what would become one of Paik's most famous pieces. The entire audience was Macinnis, me and Peter, John Cage, and two or three others. Namjoon was still not yet here in the States. He came in about a month later. And apparently what happened, as I remember, was that Peter and I were really not yet really in this circle, and we would just go into these things never knowing what we would expect. And the Fluxus people all knew that it was just going to be this giant leader, and so most of them didn't show up. And John Cage obviously didn't know who the dolphin was. This is one section from Ben Patterson's Seminar 1, here with Allison and Ben enacting, quote, 3 symmetrical events involving the fingers, eyes, and ears of both participants. Seminar 1 was treated like a seminar. It was groups of people breaking up into, like 2 people in or other group formations doing things they had discussed. And this is the way they realized this part of it. This is Dick Higgins performing Io's Rainbow No. 1 with this huge soprano. And this is another photograph from that piece. During 3 evenings in the series, while everyone was inside the performance room, Io covered the floor of the only passageway out of the loft with various materials that had to be walked on in order to get out. One night, the floor was covered wall to wall with large nails protruding several inches from the floor, and they were every inch or 2. They were just all over the place. And I had a great photograph of it. I just didn't have a slide and couldn't get it made in time. But this is another night. Sheets of glass covering photographs of women clipped from pornographic and fashion magazines. And another time, the floor was covered with soap suds. The most memorable concert in the series, full of ingenious explorations of the anatomy of the piano, occurred on May 9, 1964. A hint of what was to come was apparent in the first piece on the program. Maciunas' piano piece number 10 for Name June Pate had Dick Higgins whitewashing the instrument. And by the way, although Name June still wasn't in the United States, several of these, and maybe all of these people had met him over in Europe in the European series of concerts, and also he had an incredible reputation over there, particularly from a gesture of having cut off John Cage's necktie in one performance. And so there was a lot of anticipation about his coming here, and pieces were really written in anticipation of that. Next came Toshi Ishinagi's piano piece number 5. And, there are a lot of pieces called piano piece this, piano piece that, or variations of that, as I know it's hard to keep track of, maybe when I'm talking, and you can tell when it's in print a little bit better. Toshi Ishinagi's piano piece number 5, in which darts were thrown at the sounding board by a performer invisible in the wings. This was followed by an interlude of sorts, Brecht's performance of Lamont Young's composition 1960 number 2, a work that incidentally is another example of the continuity and concrete afterlife of many Fluxus pieces. This is the book, an anthology edited by Young and designed by Maciunas. It preceded that book with the envelopes, Fluxus 1, and it's considered pre-Fluxus. There was no Fluxus at the time this was assembled, but it was a lot of the same people and many other people. Mm-hmm. And here is composition 1960, number 2. You can see at the top, build the fire in front of the audience, and after the fire is burning, the builder will by and watch it, etc. Here is Brecht building and lighting a small pyre of kitchen matches, wooden kitchen matches, and of course watching it burn. And the residual matchsticks ended up addition in Fluxus 1 also. The fire piece was followed by Philip Horner's piano activities, one of which was he played the piano while wearing gloves, and the piano dances when he climbed from chair to keyboard to top and over the back of the instrument, etc. At this point, the piano had to be moved because for the next piece it needed to be in a different place on that very small performance area. The moving itself was the realization by Brecht and Higgins of Brecht's piano work. It was work and it was a piano. And this is the piece that it was being moved for, which is Machunis's piano piece number 13 for Nanjing Peg, also known as Carpenter's piano piece, in which he hammered down the keys. Of course, by this point, the piano, there were scandals in Europe about the destruction of pianos and musical instruments by Fluxus people. It's very offensive to some people, obviously. These used to be the junkiest pianos. And actually I was struck about a year ago, the New York Times had an article on how upright pianos are not being bought anymore from secondhand piano stores, and there's a glut of upright pianos, and they were actually trashing like dozens, maybe even hundreds of upright pianos, and I was thinking, oh my God, that's such a waste of raw materials. It's just such an incredible Fluxus piece to, incorporate. There was one more piano piece on the program, and there were some other pieces too, some really wonderful pieces that I'm not showing photographs of now. And that was Brecht's piano piece, 1962, which was a vase of flowers. This is the text. A vase of flowers on to a piano. And that was also from Waterman. As an aside, and to give some context, I'm going to read just a list of some other things that we attended on 10 days in April 1964. That last lecture that Andy was talking about, I limited myself to just 3 years, 1963, 64, 65, because I wanted to show, when I deal with the whole decade or the whole Peter Moore archive, it's just zip, zip, zip from one thing to another, and I have to gloss over things anyway, and it's even more of a gloss. And I wanted to show how dense and the variety of performances and spaces and things, just even in relation to the Judson dancers, was. So I limited myself. Well, listen to this week, and this is actually in a way a typical week that a whole book could be written about, obviously. Sunday, April 19th, Abastana. Monday, April 20th, Poussin was opening at Castellani Gallery. Wednesday, April 22nd, March and Rally Against Censorship, led by Julian Beck and Judith Molina of the Living Theater, Diane DePrima, and a lot of other people, obviously. Friday, April 24th, Jimmy Jufrey at the Hargrave Poets Playhouse, which was one of the venues I covered in that last lecture also. Saturday, April 25th, an Al Hansen happening at his Third Rail Gallery. Sunday, the 26th through Tuesday, the 28th, rehearsals and performances, Judson Dance Theater. And Wednesday, April 29th, Henry Flint picketing Stockhausen, who was in a concert of German composers at Town Hall. And it was pretty amazing. Although Fluxus absorbed multiple artistic disciplines, its primary roots were in music. One way this was particularly evident is in the language. Performances were called concerts, compositions had scores and were titled symphonies, solos, duets, and so on. Major inspiration came from the physical nature of all kinds of instruments themselves. Even members who were not professional or trained musicians, such as architect, graphic designer Machunis, writer Higgins, chemist Breck, and poet McLeod were extremely knowledgeable about music. So it's not surprising that the formal trappings of the concert stage became part of this picture. On June 27, 1964, the Fluxus Symphony Orchestra made its debut at Carnegie Recital Hall, the small subsidiary space now called Wild Recital Hall, adjacent to the more famous auditorium. And this is the signage from that evening, as you can see what kind of a hall this was. I mean, anybody could rent it. There's a mezzo-soprano recital, the High Holy Day services for a temple that must have been using the space on a regular basis, and a science of mind power lecture from the Fluxus orchestra. The orchestra was what is known as a pickup orchestra, one without a permanent roster, consisting solely of freelance musicians, in this case, a motley mix of non-musicians as well as real ones. The latter usually associated with very serious avant-garde contingents. And I didn't double check this, but for either this concert or the orchestra concert a year later, Tunis advertised in the Village Voice, musicians wanted no experience necessary. Among the professionals, though, were many downtown luminaries, such as Philip Horner, Malcolm Goldstein, Max Newhouse, James Tenney, David Behrman, who in addition to being a much admired composer, became a producer at Columbia Records, and Joshua Rifkin, who is still an eminent musicologist and was largely responsible for the ragtime revival in the 70s with his Scott Joplin recordings for Non-Such Records. A few of the pieces performed. Wind Music by Chieko Shiomi, who's now known as Mieko Shiomi. And they performed the second variation, Let Anything Be Blown by Wind. The musicians were lined up with their scores, and an offstage fan lead the music. This is Machinas performing one of those Congo scores again. And Takehisa Kasugi's organic music, which is scored for breathing by oneself, or instruments may be used incidentally. Cellist Charlotte Norman, who also did play the cello in this concert, in another piece in this program. Charlotte is in her solo appearance with Fluxus in this concert. I never considered Charlotte Fluxus. There was name Jude connection, but I think there's this distinction that other people have made between sort of Fluxus with a capital F and Fluxus with a lowercase f, or Fluxism, which is somewhat analogous to the way we've always used the word Dada, which meant very specific things at one time and then became in general use. And in fact, Charlotte and George, had a certain friction between them. Other works on the program included Ayo's Rainbow Piece for Soap Bubbles. You saw one realization of it. In this case, the bubbles were blown through wind instruments with the mouthpieces removed. And Brecht performed Word Event Exit at the end, and Philip Corner's fourth finale was the conductor leading the orchestra out of the hall and into the street. And this concert was when Pike arrived in the United States, in New York. I think he actually came even straight to the concert hall because he wasn't there at the beginning. I think he literally arrived that day. From September to November 1964, there was a perpetual Fluxus festival, and I'm not going to be showing anything from that, but it was a striking conception in that the poster, which I should have made a slide of probably, had a circular design by Machunas, and it was divided up like the spokes of a wheel or a pie chart. And within each of the segments, there would be the artist's name and the date, but there was no year. So that you could start at any place in the circle, and there would be that concert, and 2 weeks later, the next one, et cetera, and you go around the circle, and you come back to the first person, and you could keep going, year after year after year, on the same date, the same person would perform. What basically happened from September to November, this took place at this very large commercial gallery. It was a whole big, huge cast iron building on LaGuardia Place. And basically, they went out of business. They went bankrupt or something after a while. And it was just huge, and they didn't even have good art. And Flux, they were showing really bad abstract expressionism and all kinds of things for the most part. They had a few interesting things, but anyway, they couldn't make any money. And so the Perpetual Fluxus Festival continued in another location from June to August 1965. And that location was what was then the Cinematheque, which is the predecessor of Anthology Film Archives. It was at 85 East 4th Street, a building in a theater kind of space that still exists. It's been a series of theaters over the years. It's been called Crane Gallery Bar now, I think just KGB, it's still there. So there were all these other concerts. And just to give you a place in time, a lot of you will know about the series in Cafe Au Go-Go that George Brecht and Bob Watts organized. And that had started in November of '64. So right about the time all these other things were going on. On September 25th, 1965, there was another orchestra concert at the recital hall. And by this time, George was using a compression of the word Fluxus, just he shortened it to Flux in the fall, late summer, early fall of 1965. So the multiples were called Flux boxes, and there were some Flux kits, and everything was just Flux instead of the full construction, and so the orchestra was just the Flux Orchestra. Now, this second Flux Orchestra concert had been preceded in early September by Charlotte Moorman's 3rd annual New York Avant-Garde Festival, which took place in another recital hall opposite Carnegie, bringing to a head a rivalry in which Machunas was convinced her scheduling was intended to preempt his Fluxus program and steal Fluxus artists. And there was also, starting in '64, a lot of friction between Dick Higgins and George Machunas. And these are things I am just not going to get into now. It's, because people were still doing programs that were really, really interesting. In this second Flux Orchestra concert, okay, this is George Brecht's On the Floor. This is the rehearsal in which the entire orchestra falls off their chairs as conductor Lamont Young lowers his baton. On the same program, Io, in the real program, it's no rehearsal, Io performed 3 pieces simultaneously, which was a favorite Fluxus strategy for programming. Shiomi's event for late afternoon, the instructions read, suspend the violin with a long rope. And so this ribbon was attached to the floor. Bob Watts' piece, called 2 Inches, says stretch 2-inch ribbon across stage. And of course, that's why this is a ribbon instead of a rope. And the final part of Bob's instructions are cut ribbon, and that's Anthony Cox's sword piece as well. And Ira performed it flawlessly. Yoko Ono's Sky Piece to Jesus Christ, in which members of the orchestra wrap each other in bandages. And that's Yoko dabbing Lamont Young, who's in the suit there. Other works on the program included Tony Cox's tactical pieces for orchestra, in which the violins were used as slingshots and the horns as blow tubes. In June 1966, Maciunas, always on the lookout for offbeat places to stage events, booked a room at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel to present a flux clinic based on one that the Japanese group High Red Center had created a year or so before. For authenticity, the clinicians, of which I was one, all wore regulation lab coats embroidered with the professional title flux worker on the chest. This is Kasugi's tongue being measured by Bob Watts. Measuring head volume by displacement of water from a rope. And measuring kick height. In November 1967, there was a, whoops, I'm actually not sure that. In November 1967, there was an exhibition called Made with Paper at what was then the Museum of Contemporary Crafts, and it's now the Museum of Art and Design, and it was previously located on 53rd Street down the block from MoMA. And by this time, George had enough of an art world reputation as a graphic designer to be commissioned to make an elaborate press package that accompanied the otherwise conventional catalog. To add to this degree of establishment acceptance, he was also hired to present a Flux paper concert that took place in the Time Life Building Auditorium, Time Life being the sponsor of the whole shebang. So you can see it was pretty much an establishment venue. I'm not going to show pictures of that, but there's a reason that I'm bringing it up, because some of the pieces on this program had a political edge, something that during a period of grim, relentless war was as missing from the Fluxus canon as it had been from large swaths of the art world. For years, Maciunas and Henry Flint have been railing against cultural imperialism, Flint seemingly more preoccupied with Stockhausen than with Vietnam. Incorporating politics into art was a volatile subject overall, and within Fluxus had caused a fair amount of dissension early on. In retrospect, 1967, the year of the biggest peace march, appears to be the point at which art workers in general got fed up. It was then that Maciunas, probably fearful of stirring up his colleagues once again, anonymously published his famous anti-war poster with stars made out of skulls and crossbones and stripes formed from historical genocide statistics. Outside of Fluxus, bracketed by a group called Angry Arts in 1967, and then there was the Miley Massacre in 1968, and then the Kent State student killings and the US invasion of Cambodia in 1970, artists began to forcefully protest. That was the period of the Art Workers Coalition, the People's Flag Show, and other activities at Jefferson Memorial Church, the Guerrilla Art Action Group, and demonstrations. There was one particular one in the streets of Soho for Moratorium Weekend, which if I remember, was in reaction to Kent State. Returning to the subject of Fluxus itself, after the 1967 paper concert, the extraordinary succession of Fluxus performances in New York nearly ceased for several years, giving way to the most prolific period of Maciunas' publications program. This was in large part due to the distraction of his challenging the illegality of the lofts artists were living in by forming Flux House co-ops beginning in 1966. Referring to the abundance of neglected industrial Soho buildings, he said, quote, "If we get enough of us in there, they can't get us out," unquote. Performance-wise, there were more or less yearly New Year's Eve dinners that attracted not only Fluxus, but a more wide-ranging crowd of Sohoites. These are some pictures from the December 31st, 1969 New Year's Eve dinner. In the front are the blown-out eggshells, which were a collaboration between me and George. I spent weeks, it seems, if you know how to blow out an eggshell, where you make a hole and you can blow out the inside and keep the eggshell intact. And then we filled them with all different things, such as gelatin, liquid Jello, and then when you put it in the refrigerator, it became Jello. And I remember using a tweezer to put small pieces of very thin spaghetti inside, and you have them leave enough room so that when you cooked it, it would, and it swelled, you couldn't break the shell. And these were filled with all kinds of different things. And then over to the right and about the middle, there's a bedpan with jalapeno, which is shipped cookies. Which are very good. And lots of other things, of course. George was very happy that evening. There were a lot of performances that evening too. And these are the drinks he made. There's tea made out of jute and rope and various other things. There was a John and Yoko Flux Fest on April 1st, 1970, which took place at Joe Jones's, part of it took place at Joe Jones's music store on North Moore Street, and some of it was out on the street. John and Yoko hadn't yet come to the United States. They were supposed to come, and this was supposed to be in honor of them with their participation, and they were delayed. And so everybody, Maciunas made John and Yoko masks, paper masks that everybody wore for that series. On December 17th, 1970, New York Fluxus traveled to Douglas College in New Jersey for the triple treat of a Flux Mass, Flux Sports, and an exhibition of multiples called the Flux Show. The Flux Mass in the Douglas College Chapel included the required Catholic rituals, but of course with liturgical variations. This is Yoshiwada as priest, the gorilla assistants breaking the bread, which I think was made out of plaster, Jeff?
Yeah, it was
They were
marinated,
They
been
were
involved in
breaking
making it
cloths.
too.
Paper mache.
Paper mache
Oh, it was paper mache?
and filled with sawdust.
Yeah. There's clubs, and these are the assistants' feet. June 24th, 1971 was the Flux divorce of Jeff Hendricks, who's in the audience, and Beachy Forbes, in which they split in half not only various rooms in their Chelsea brownstone, but individual pieces of furniture. By 1973, a new era of performances began, reinvigorated by Maciunas' having moved to the basement of the Flux House at 80 Worcester Street. He had moved there a couple years before, and where he had access to the Cinematheque's ground floor theater. In May, 2 full weekends were devoted to a Flux Game Fest there. Table soccer, Pike playing Takako Saito's box soccer with George rooting him on. A treadmill wheel, which I think is by Bob Watts. I've never been able to clarify this one.
From San Diego.
Yeah. Okay, now, this was out in the street, no permission asked. This is the way Soho looked in those days. There were galleries on the main thoroughfare of West Broadway, what was then the main thoroughfare of West Broadway. But Worcester Street would be deserted on the weekend. It was still all factories with some artist residence. And nobody asked permission. Trisha Brown, in about the same period, Trisha Brown did performances at once. Takako Saito's Rubber Ring Race with George.
That's Watts again.
I'm sorry?
That's Watts again, San Diego, 1968.
Well, I used to think it was the other way around, and Mrs. Watts.
It's printed.
But George wrote it as Rubber Ring Race for us to Takako's. I checked it this time again.
Okay, I yield.
Well, okay, that shows something. We've run into this before. Pieces that are very similar get recredited constantly, and
There's printed evidence from 68.
oh, good. Okay, I would love to see
Yeah,
that.
that also has-
George may have been wrong. He was sometimes
Well,
wrong.
George was often wrong.
Yes. Okay. So they're both by Watts.
And, well,
Okay, we can't do it. We'll discuss it later.
let's say it's a collective.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's, okay. The Flux vehicle made of 5 bicycles. And Io shoes, another race. Actually about shoes, not necessarily this piece. There was also controversy because Io felt Allison had stolen a piece of his, which was shoes, because the pieces were so similar. It was really hard to tell them apart.
Still.
Actually, Bradley, could you turn on that air conditioner again a little bit?
Yeah.
You're still here? There was a Flux harpsichord concert in March of 1975 at 80 Worcester Street. In general now, Soho is still inhabited mostly by artists and art represented. Although not yet a shopping mall, the galleries that were proliferated had their own anointed superstars that attracted media attention. Attention that ignored the Fluxus in its midst. Machinas decided to get even. In April of 1975, he plastered the area with handbills announcing a show of 12! Exclamation point. Big names! Exclamation point. Listing the most crowd-pleasing art world personalities he could think of. Vito Acconci, Joseph Beuys, Philip Glass, Alan Capro, Les Levine, Piero Manzoni, Bruce Nauman, Yoko Ono, Michael Snow, Klaus Rinke, Wolf Ostell, and Andy Warhol. On the day of the event, the line for admission stretched down the block. The theater at, you know what's coming. The theater at 80 Worcester was packed, with many people unable to get in. On a screen more or less the size of the one you're looking at, the Judas projected the names, one by one, each for a good 5 minutes. The audience was furious. They paid good money for this, and they left in rows. This is one to satisfy. And this is George, who's totally delighted. He have done exactly what he had hoped to do. It was the names that counted. In April 1976, there was a Fluxus time concert at the Clock Tower on Leonard Street, one of the vacant city-owned spaces that Alana Heiss had turned into a marvelous art location actually this was the same year as she took over PS1 in Queens, but this was before her organization was subsumed by MoMA, long before. Larry Miller, who's also in the audience here, installed fan blades on one of the clock tower faces. And Peter contributed a piece to this. He made a 2-hour time exposure on Polaroid film. The long exposure resulting in a blur-filled print described as, quote, eliminating all performers from the performance room, unquote. Could you change the carousel, please? And there's only about another 10 minutes here. In 1975, Neptunus lost his left eye from a beating by an electrician to whom he owed money. This resulted in enough sympathy to wipe out much of the fractiousness of the previous decade. It culminated in a surprise dinner in Neptunus's honor in May 1976. Loving tributes and Fluxus wordplay by both old friends and former enemies poured in from throughout the world and were published in a special issue of E-Trade, the Fluxus newspaper, and this is the distribution. And Sarah Siebel was here, was the editor of that, Bob Watts, and Jeff was one of the organizers. The event took place in the working loft of Zachar Offset, Neptunus's dedicated longtime printers. Zachar's main business was in pornography, and their non-discriminatory, laissez-faire attitude had always been the key to getting Fluxus oddities and Henry Flint's Marxist diatribes into print. This was the long table, and Jeff, I don't know if you're performing or just announcing things there.
Yeah, I was kind of master of ceremonies and
Yeah.
things.
This is Pike, and then one of Jeff's students, right?
Yeah, Bob Wickenden.
But he's not performing, just happens to be back there. Allison Knowles, Roberto Liu, and Nick Higgins are performing. Henry Flint performing. Neptunus making a face from behind Jeff's course of lips.
And the olive flowers.
Portrait, which was a Polaroid with Peter.
Wow.
Also in May '76, there was a series of Flux tours. One was a tour of prestigious Soho galleries arranged by Larry Miller. Here's Neptunus. Is this a Castelli, though, Larry?
No, that's not Castelli. That was one of the more kind of offbeat galleries at the top of West Broadway, whose name I can't remember, but this is George explaining the electrical system, which has, of course, nothing to do with the art whatsoever.
And I've also been explaining the plumbing. Anything is plumbing.
Well, the whole point of the tour was to ignore the art.
Okay. Now, George Brecht's tour for foreign visitors, in which Soho was described in various foreign languages, and this is Neptunus, so it must be Lithuanian. And Namjoon conducting the foreign language tour in Korean, but he also spoke Japanese, so maybe either of those or both. Now, here they're in a stairwell of 359 Canal Street, and this is 1976. And note the handprints on the wall at the right, still in place more than 10 years after the doorbell pictures I showed you in the beginning. You know, gentrification was very slow moving in those days. And this is from that same tour, but there's a little confusion here too, because the same day as the tour, one of the tours, there were two tours of one visitors. Joey Matthews, who's pictured in the middle there, gave a tour of exotic sites, and one of the exotic sites was the original Vauxhall Workshop building. So I'm not sure, even though Aunt June is wearing the hat, this may be partially in Joan's tour. In early September 1976, the New York Fluxus contingent, including Peter, traveled to Berlin, where they were featured in the Soho Downtown Manhattan Festival and performances, and Larry and George built the Fluxus Labyrinth, and various activities there. In summer of that year, Maciunas had lost his loft at 80 Worcester Street, the Flux House co-op that housed the Cinematheque at the time, which had then become Anthology Film Archives, and then, of course, Anthology eventually moved to this building with some side. And I guess the public theater came before 80 Worcester. Anyway, I'm not sure I have the chronology there correctly. But anyway, he bought a sprawling, somewhat run-down estate with a large main house and several outbuildings in New Marlborough, Massachusetts, planning to support it as a bed and breakfast. He also hoped to entice his New York colleagues there to occupy some of the smaller structures and operate as a flux collective they all adored. In winter, however, blanketed with snow, the property became the perfect setting for a delirious weekend of snow events. The house had room for all the New Yorkers in Minnesota. George, who claimed not like children, originally banned them from However, I have to tell you, George babysat for us once. That's a whole other story. Babysat for us. Anyway, he originally banned children. And first Peter and I, then Jeff, and Dick and Allison, and I think Jackson McLean maybe, said, well, in that case, we could attend. So he relented. And all the children came and had a wonderful time too, of course. The spirit is well represented by this photograph of everyone marching across a virgin white field to George's drumbeat, a photograph to which Peter gave the title, and Peter's photographs are never titled. In exhibitions or in captions, you give a descriptive title, but George, he called this one Fluxus Making Tracks. And here you can see George drumming this while marching ahead. Now, about what George is wearing there. The house that he bought on this estate came with an enormous attic filled with examples of the prior family's clothing encompassing most of the 20th century. There were flapper dresses, debutante gowns, male and female riding habits, and most significantly, World War I uniforms that fit George perfectly. All the time. I don't know how many of you know, it's very commercial now, but there's a place in Rhinebeck called the, I don't remember, the something drone, where it's all vintage airplanes. And that was within a drive of George's place. And George would wear the full regalia of the soldiers' World War I uniform, wearing the boots, and these planes would be flying really trips from the film period. Throughout 1977, he hosted numerous parties for his bed and breakfast boarders and visiting friends, each one geared to a different 20th century decade. For these, we plundered the attic for costumes and danced to appropriate music. One week Charleston, another week swing, etc. But these were incidental to Fluxus. The January snow events turned out to be the last organized Fluxus gathering unsullied by a poignant undercurrent. In summer 1977, George began experiencing severe stomach pain. It wasn't until New Year's week 1978 that he was finally diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. In short order, he married one of his boarders, Billy Hutching, and if you didn't know Billy, that's a woman, Billy, not a man. And visiting New York for tests and potential treatment, arranged several special events built around his having finally made public his delight in dressing in drag. On February 16th, he and Billy waitressed at Ear Inn, the popular artist hangout on Farmers Spring Street that's still there, although I doubt if it's most of the artists anymore. This is Ear Inn. On February 25th, the couple, who had already been legally married, held a flux wedding with both of them as brides. And poor George, he was so full of morphine that day that he didn't realize his meal was asleep, I guess. The ceremony was accompanied by a flux cabaret and an incredible banquet of erotically themed foods. And this is George running the program, cabaret. George and Billy performed Black and White, in which George, now in formal male attire, and Billy, still in her white gown, exchanged clothing. George died on May 9, 1978. In the Fluxus tradition of taking life's rituals, the Catholic Mass, divorce, marriage, as raw material, there was a Flux funeral during which Larry Miller's delightful Jack-in-the-Box, complete with eye patch, popped up to wave goodbye. That's all. Thank you. Any questions, anybody have?
And it's kind of specific, but you said that you lost you said that you lost the loft at 80 Brewster Street?
Well, it was sold. I mean, you know, okay, thank you. Yeah, he had to move, he was forced to move, basically, yeah. He got that loft, I think he got it either free or very cheaply in exchange for work he'd done on the building. It was part of the Cinematheque, Anthology Cinematheque floor that was below their floor, but was where they kept their storage, I guess, and stuff. Sarah?
Technically, I'm very interested in all the photographs. Have you made them into slides or
Okay,
scans?
this is a serious problem, because the quantity of material, and actually, when I agreed to do this lecture, I thought this is gonna be a piece of cake, you know, I spent a lot of time preparing slides, but I had done a Fluxus lecture at the Local Arts Center for the Fluxus exhibition in the Spirit of Fluxus in 1993. So I thought I still had the text of that, which would have been all the proper research probably. And I guess I used slides for that. And then Peter had done a lecture at Anthology when it was 1992, whichever the location was then.
Here.
Here.
It was here,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, right. And so I thought, oh, I have a text to start off from, all the research done, the slides. Well, I go into the slides, half of them are faded, you know, and throw them out. And it's been, I've accumulated an incredible number of slides over the years. I like using slides very much still. And, but anyway, I really had to work with what I had because of not just the expense. I mean, Larry Seven has been doing new slides a lot of times when I want them for lectures, and he's been doing a wonderful job. But this was like very close to the wire, and there were other upheavals in my life, and I actually made a pile of prints that I would have liked to make slides and include them. But scanning them would have been the same issue. In other words, I really was not in a position to add much new material.
But these are, you're projecting slides here today?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, it's up there.
We can't have any slides duplicated anymore. There's no way to have slide dupes made.
Larry Seven has a lab in Chelsea. I'll get you the name. He does them for me on film. Yeah.
That's great.
Just don't use Bevo, which will do it also, but I had a horrible experience with it.
Barbara?
Oh, is that Larry there?
Yep.
Yes, hi. Would you give Sarah the
Barbara, some propaganda.
I'm sorry, is somebody else calling me?
Yeah, I am back here, Gary.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Barbara, how you doing?
Hi.
I've got a very esoteric question to ask you. When they're thinking up of their performances, what would be an inspiration for them to complete the idea of their performance? I mean, I'm speaking very generally. I mean, like the ribbon from or the strings, you know. I don't know how else to explain that. Anybody have any
Well,
opinion?
if you saw it from, I'm not sure if I understand you, the way
Yeah.
I'm understanding it is that you saw some of the scores
Mm-hmm.
as they would be seen by, the artists who wanted to perform,
Right.
or the non-artists.
And that would be the
And
procedures
then you
to
would
complete
have,
the act?
you would interpret it in some way.
Oh, okay.
And that was very evident.
Wow.
There are a lot of these pieces that even if originally it was open to multiple interpretations, certain conventions have developed. And the person to answer that question in a way is Larry Miller, who's just brilliant in interpreting these pieces.
Well, thank you for that vote of confidence. I wouldn't agree with it, but
Well, see, that's
I would say as someone who I feel is relatively young in Fluxus, even though I'm an old dude now. As someone who kind of felt like as a graduate student at Rutgers and who discovered the brilliance of Fluxus scores and Fluxus performance, I began to look at it very closely and try to analyze it in a way that this person is speaking. And I could not come up with a formula. There was no formula.
That's right.
There was no formula. There were scores that were written almost like haiku poetry, which one can then interpret into action, right? And then there were also from that and from the persona of Machunas and others, actions that happened on the stage that were live performance that you could project from that another kind of performance, and then in retrospect write a score in order to reproduce that performance.
Oh, that's right. I mentioned,
So there's no one avenue. There's no,
Yeah,
there's no one avenue of perfect, Fluxus writing for scores. I mean, a lot of them were just done, and then the scores were kind of written afterwards.
well, that's, I mentioned that about the extemporaneous.
Yes, yes, you did.
thing.
Thank you for answering my question.
I don't know if I did.
You did, right on, thank
But
you.
if you saw any of the concerts that Larry organizes, he does get it just right.
Thank you.
Mary?
I feel like this is a really stupid question, but what exactly does fluxus mean in terms of the way George named it? Like what
Well,
was he
it's a
trying to
word from the
define?
dictionary in Latin and everything, and meaning,
Change or flow.
well, yeah, flow, change,
Fusion.
whatever.
I
You know, there's a printed, in some of the Fluxus publications, there's a printed dictionary version of it, whatever.
But I think George enjoyed the,
The
both
ambiguity.
the, abnormal discharge of
Yeah,
flux
yes,
and
yes,
then the welded fusing.
yeah.
And so it's like both, purging
Purging,
and then
yeah,
coming
that's-
together and bonding.
Yeah.
Could I just say another aspect of Fluxus, which I've experienced through Larry and Sarah and Jeff Hendricks, is generosity. It's a very generous art movement, and I think you sort of show that today in giving us these little prints. I thought that was a fantastic moment when you gave those out. That to me was the Flux moment tonight.
Yeah, Fluxus, I mean, I didn't get into all kinds of issues like how much it was collective and I mean, it actually, there's something I'd like to say that I originally thought to have as the ending for this. And, after Machinus died, there was a vacuum. There really was a vacuum. And we were all stunned. And I even wrote an article in Art Forum, and I basically said Fluxus was over. Not some other people were saying that. Of course, a lot of people said no. But the thing is, George was so much of an organizer that even when it was collective, his imprint was on certain aspects of it, and certainly with the publications, which were almost exclusively his designs. And I felt, I wanted to say this for a long time, I felt that the person, now there's Fluxus all over the place, and Fluxus did not die. And I've long felt that the person who, at least in the New York area, was responsible for that was Emily Harding. And I purposely limited myself, once again, if I choose a very narrow sphere, I can show more concentrated material. It's never enough in a way, but, so that's why I stopped. The death of Machinus is a natural place to break in a way. And Peter's photographs later, repeated a lot of the same pieces that he was photographing too. And, but the thing that happened with Emily was like a den mother, but she wasn't a creative artist. And correct me if any of you who, a lot of you were there, if you feel differently. Emily gave the Fluxus people a home which they didn't have otherwise. And at the same time, by her being a gallery, a real gallery, the emphasis seemed to shift a lot in terms of making it more a gallery art, even though the other things were going on. And in certain people's work, you see that, I think, more than others, that things were being made to hang on the wall. I mean, Dick Higgins was painting and, you know, all different things. I mean, it's not that, in George's time, people had, a lot of the Fluxus people had like two separate lives. And they did different kinds of work for both of them. Jeff is a good example. You know, the cloud paintings and sky paintings and things you showed at Bianchini, but you didn't show them as part of Fluxus. You know, it's a little hard to draw hard and fast lines, but anyways, the Fluxus that we see now is very, very different in concept in many ways. And as I say, there are comparisons with things like Dada and Surrealism and whatever, you know, these things all change too. But I don't know, I do feel Emily's never received enough credit for that.
Barbara, would you see Jean Dupuis as kind of a link between George and Emily? Because he had the loft earlier, had the drama theater and so forth.
I don't know if there's as much of a, I don't know if I make it quite that pointed, I don't know. But that doesn't mean, I mean not right about it.
Jean certainly established a lot of activity there in that space. And then Emily took it over as a gallery. And it was the space where George's wedding took place and so forth.
But then he was also more general performance art, you know, with a variety of things. So I don't know.
Do we want to really talk about like is Fluxus dead or alive? I mean, is that
I don't
really
want to talk
relevant?
about
Do you really think it's a relevant question? I mean, I hear it all the time.
No, well, there's a lot of Fluxus, whatever. And
There's a lot of people calling themselves
it's
Fluxus.
right, everybody calls everything Fluxus, and that. So, but there was this period, you know, in the 80s and 90s when, you know, Emily was the place where people showed their work, right?
So
I
it's
mean,
an
I'm talking about local, you know.
open question.
I was never really involved in the European scene at all, and I think, you know, there were different things.
With great shows like Ben Patterson's there.
Well, they also, it tended to muddy the waters a bit, also though, because, you know, people get pegged with being Fluxus. Did you give that information to Sarah? People get pegged with being Fluxus, which Emily did. But then she was showing Carol Lee and Alan Hepburn and whatever. And, you know, so this tended to muddy the waters a lot. But once again, she did give a generation of people a home to show their work. Yes.
When this art movement was in Europe, was it also called Fluxus?
Yeah. So
the name originated in Europe?
the name originated with Majunas here, but then he went to Europe. There were Fluxus, the first Fluxus concerts were in Europe, but that was people from New York were part of that.
But he didn't come up with the name.
Yes, he did.
Yes, it is.
Mhm.
Yes, he did.
Wow.
Andy?
I just want to ask a question, getting away from Fluxus, about Peter. And Peter, as a photographer, who some of the images we've seen here are iconic in so many ways, and what you showed in the last presentation, and in any catalog you pick up on Fluxus or performance. And I just wonder, as a photographer, whether he was somebody who subscribed to the like Henri Cartier-Bresson decisive moment philosophy of one shot, or if we were to look at his contact sheets, if you'd see him honing in and composing in the moment and trying to get this one shot.
Both. I mean, Cartier-Bresson shirt for Life magazine, and it was about making picture stories, and that was what photojournalism was about. And Peter was very much in that mindset of those photographers who were working at that time. So, anyway, yeah, well.
I'm curious about the you mentioned very briefly like this shift from a stark absence of politics to politics coming into George's work with that poster, and Henry also went to politics in the late 60s. I'd just be curious to hear any more about that transition for those people or that scene.
Yeah, I can't really, say much about it. I mean, it's a very big subject. Politics was generally absent from Fluxus, and it was absent from large parts of the art world. And then everybody got galvanized at a certain point by what was happening. People woke up. But Fluxus, there's also different definitions of politics. I mean, Fluxus was very much involved with thumbing its nose at art world politics, which is what, the big name show really was. That's politics. So, And George had been bruised because, early on, when he and Henry were picketing and writing all these manifestos and things, that turned a lot of people against him and Fluxus. So he tended to keep them mostly separate. Yes?
I was just curious, you mentioned that you just started going. Were there a lot of people going to the early performances, or were you an anomaly? Was it really, a really insular group? I know a friend of mine was one of the early people in Soho, and he's like, you'd see other people, but you'd kind of, like people really kept to themselves, and that was his impression of living there. So he was there at this time.
We never lived in Soho.
Right. But I mean, were there a lot of other people that might show up at these performances, or was it primarily?
Well, George would plaster, as I said, he was very frustrated at one point. In fact, when he did these flyers, and like the Game Fest, which was in 1973, and there was this flyer, and then you could see the people in the pictures were just us, even though we're out in the street. Right? And George, at one point, he showed me a flyer or something, and I asked if I could have a copy. He was going to put it up someplace, and I asked if I could have a copy. He said he hadn't printed very many. He said, because if he went to a lot of trouble to publicize it, nobody was going to come anyway. And that was the attitude he had with this big names show, where he did publicize it to sort of show up, this attitude about these big stars. And yeah, that's.
But I would have to say that there was a huge difference between the 60s in Soho and the 70s. Because
Yes.
by the 70s, there were restaurants and bars and
Yes.
a lot of alternative spaces. It was
Yes.
very active.
Yes, but Worcester, Green, and Mercer were still deserted a lot
We
on
were all at
weekends.
Food Restaurant eating and talking
But that
about
was on
things.
Prince Street. It was on the major
We were
road.
there.
So what?
In Soho. whereas in the early sixties.
Oh, it was very different, yes, but it was still compared to what it became. You'd say it was not very heavily trafficked on weekends.
I just would like to add, like, to her point, that it's often difficult for very young people, and I'm speaking like people younger than me, which is most of the audience, in the 20s and 30s and so forth, that the audience in the 60s, and even the audience in the 70s, when I really came on full force, was very small
Yeah,
and a very dedicated audience. That was the difference. There was no, as I recall it, sense of like, well, we're coming to this for entertainment. There was some sort of dedication, and my sense, I mean, I wasn't around for the early Fluxus when you were in the early 60s, and when it was mainly the artists attending. You know, I mean, it was really a sort of insular kind of crowd. I mean, it was not about attracting an audience. It was about, I would describe it more as a workshop. And even I think that extended somewhat into the 70s.
I mentioned that there were other things like Trisha Brown, did her leaning duets out in the street, also on Worcester Street and whatever, and it also shows, very few people around. But that was actually, when she did those, it was the same day she did that piece, which is very famous now, which was recreated by the Whitman a couple of years ago, which is Man Walking Down the Side of the Building, and which was done originally at the back of 80 Worcester Street, where Trisha also lived. And you'll see the pictures of that. There's like 10 people in the backyard watching this piece. And that piece was heavily advertised, and Trisha was already known among, the art world people, and those are the people who came. But it's very hard to, when you see it today, to realize how that was. Anyway, so.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.